Welcome to episode 3 of the Business of Real Estate podcast with Lynn Hoffman and Eric Johnson. Today's session is Money Matters, and we're talking all things financial when we get back. Okay, everybody, here we are talking about Money Matters. And Lynn, I think, we were talking the first couple of episodes, right, about being the CEO of your business. It is a business, you have to treat it like that. And I don't know about you, but I know when I'm talking to agents and, we do business audits here at RE/MAX Niagara and RE/MAX Escarpment. And one of the things that baffles me is when an agent says, yeah, okay, it's great, let's talk about the money I'm bringing in, but I don't want to know how much I spend. It's amazing how much these agents will avoid knowing how much they're spending because it is so easy to spend money in this business, isn't it?
Well, it's all we do for the first probably year to year and a half in the business is money outgoing. And that causes so much stress on the home front as well. So I think the reason people don't want to know what the numbers are is because they actually don't want to know the answer. Everybody loves what they do and they just want to do it. So they're not too concerned until the bank account runs out how much money they're spending on it. But they really should know because we talked about this before. If you don't know the return on investment, then why are you doing it? So you have to have a plan, and we go back to the plan all the time. When you come into real estate, most people come from a job. And in that job, the goal is to about every 2 weeks, you get a paycheck that comes. And that job comes from showing up at your workplace and putting in your 8 hours, and then every 2 weeks you get a paycheck. Well, being your CEO of your own business, that doesn't happen here. So now you have to become the person that knows the finances inside and out, know your numbers, know your costs. And so that's what we're here to help you with this morning, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think, one of the key things that I've found is the not having a budget and not having money set aside. I know that we both do recruiting and we both talk to a lot of new people coming into the business, and sometimes they reach out to us, they're just starting the courses. Mm-hmm. I always say to people, and I don't know what you tell them, but I know I say that you should be looking for anywhere from like 3 to 6 months, preferably 6 months worth of expenses when you first start out. And then even once you get going, because, we all know that at the beginning, you could get very lucky and get something off the bat, but it typically takes a couple of months to get your first deal. And then it takes another month or two to get it paid out. And then for a seasoned agent, you guys, if you're a seasoned agent, you know that there could be some dry months. And, unless you have that consistency in your marketing, and sometimes the market changes. We had some things happen in the last couple of years. We had a very bad quarter there at the end of 2022. Right. Things were slow for some people when COVID first hit. So having that cushion means that we're not worried. And, I've seen agents asking for advances on deals just because they're not managing their money. So, your thoughts on that, on having that nest egg, so to speak?
Well, a couple things came to mind when you said that. The first thing is consistency of the business. So we'll get talking about that a little later, but you always have to keep your pipeline of clients filled. You always have to know where the next client is coming from and build that consistency. But when you're talking about financials, it's not sexy and it's no fun, but the first phase is stability. And we talk about putting some money aside. When you get that paycheck, it's not all your paycheck. It's not all your commission. Some of that's going to the government. Some of that has to be set aside for other things that you need to manage. But in the beginning, if you can have, when you first start in this business, 3 to 6 months in reserve, you're going to need that amount of time and sincerely need that money, because in the beginning, you're paying a lot of money out, you're not getting any steady income coming in, and as Eric pointed out, it's at least 60 days before it closes, sometimes even longer. And then there's the dreaded thought that what if it doesn't close? And unfortunately, in different markets, as market shifts, that can start to happen. So you start off slow. You start off by trying to get 1 or 2 months ahead, but the goal should be to eventually have a year of money tucked aside for emergencies, for such things as a turn in the market or things like that. You know you're going to have a seasonal change in the market. Most agents sell all their product between January and June, big closing, and then it goes a little quiet. So definitely planning, knowing what your expenses are, and knowing how much you need to put aside each month, and being very strong with that is going to help.
Yeah, and we're both strong on encouraging agents to have those budgets, and we've talked about this before. Is there's got to be an overall budget for your business. There's got to be an overall budget for marketing a listing. Then you have your marketing budget, separately. And I know I was sharing with you that spreadsheet I created for our agents, where we have a tab for every expense, and then it goes on to a summary tab. But even within the transactional tab, I have columns set aside for the government federal income tax,
Right.
your provincial tax, and then your HST here in Canada. Then you have, we set aside a column for marketing.
Right.
So that, because everybody asks, like, what should we be spending on marketing? You're going to hear a lot of different answers. I say anywhere between 10 and 20% of your gross commission. That's a pretty decent budget. You can do more, you can do less. There's no hard rule here. But I like having, taking each paycheck or each check that comes in and taking a portion of that, putting it into a marketing account, so that if I don't have the money in that account, I don't spend it and I don't get in over my head. And I think, there's a lot of agents out there that when we're both coaching, that they're struggling with that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Your thoughts on, like, what do you recommend in terms of marketing and setting money aside? And
Well, I think that's going to grow as your business grows. So that's going to be a moving target. But again, most important is whatever you decide to spend extra funds on for marketing. And I'm going to throw in staging here, because staging has become a huge piece of this puzzle and a very big expense. So I'm going to throw that in as well. You're going to have to make a decision. And in the beginning, you might only be able to afford to put 10% away, and then build that up to whatever it is you need for your campaigns and things like that. But the whole issue is, we don't put the cart before the horse. We've got to make sure that we've always got clients, we've got income coming in, and then project what that income is, and then project what your expenses are going to be, and your household expenses are going to be. Again, to your point, we've got federal tax, we've got all these other things that have to come off the top right away. Yes, you're going to get some tax deductions, so you might want to calculate what you think your tax deductions are going to be every year and how much that's going to save you. But you have to have these numbers on these strong expenses that are there every single month. But as far as the marketing budget goes, I think that's something I would look to be growing. I might start out with a 10% and then maybe work it up even to 30%, so that you could do more outreach, social media outreach, AdWorks, things like that.
Oh, for sure. And, I think one of the things that gets left out is that if you are an agent, look to leverage some others and look to leverage partners. I've seen people where they do events all by themselves, but if you partner up with somebody, it costs you, half the money. You split the cost. So there's ways of saving some money when it comes to designing up your business and designing up some of your events. But the biggest thing, I think, is the lack of having an active budget that you're looking at on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's a
Right?
bad word. So I'm
I
sitting
know.
here, I'm sitting here talking to you guys about budgets and agreeing with Eric. And for 25 years, I didn't have a budget. And that was a wake-up call. Anyway, so it's not what happens when you have the budget. It's what happens when you don't have the budget. You run out of money is quite simply the case. So it has to be set aside, and you have to know what these numbers are to know what you're doing. As you grow, that's going to change a bit. But I would like to see everybody know what they think their expenses are going to be. And how you spend that money also. We haven't talked about that. So there's passive aggressive marketing, which is like billboards, buses, park benches. That's passive aggressive money. Do you need to spend it? Well, somebody tell me what their return on investment on that park bench is. I'd like to know what they're getting, how they can track what they got for that money. And it's not cheap. But it gets your face out there, and I get that, but it's still passive aggressive marketing. I like to see more targeted marketing,
Yep.
which would be, come to my client event and spending money on a client event. That has been one of the most successful things I've seen my agents do, where they spend, a few $1,000s, they bring clients out to an event, be it whatever they like, an ice cream event, a day in the park with people, friends, whatever. But that's a really good targeted way to spend the money. So again, you're putting a budget aside. What's it for? How much is the return going to be for that budget?
Yep.
All very important things to consider.
And when you said about where you're spending it, I think for me, it's often a blurred line, I think, for a lot of agents, and I've had this discussion a number of times, is the difference between prospecting and marketing. And like you said, those billboards, those benches, all that stuff, that's great for brand recognition.
Yeah.
And that means that when people are out there, you're talking, having a conversation, someone says, hey, aren't you that person? So there's that recognition that adds some authority to what you're saying. But when you look at prospecting is where we're going out and we're trying to generate conversations. I've always said your main business or your main job as a real estate agent is having conversations, because that's where deals happen. That's when leads come in, or somebody says, yeah, let's talk about selling my house. So that prospecting is where we generate the business. Marketing gets people's attention and can generate some activity, but we want to be careful that in that marketing aspect that we don't go totally just for brand recognition, because as you said, it's the return on investment. And
Right.
so that's the other part of the financials, is not just looking at, okay, here's my budget. That's great. I'm spending this money. Fantastic. But what am I getting in return?
Right.
And so my phrase is know your numbers.
Right.
You got to know your numbers. And if you're a team leader, and I'm going to throw the teams in this, and we'll have an episode on teams later on, and you'll hear me say know your numbers all the time. Mm-hmm. But you bring on, I see teams bringing on people, and then they're giving these splits where it's like they're not getting the return. Like they're paying for all these fees, and they're paying for the marketing for a listing, and they're paying for all this stuff. And then what they get back, and it's like, man, they're just barely making money.
Mm-hmm,
Some of them are breaking even, some of them are losing money. And so there's a lot of things when we talk about financials, but it is about tracking what you're spending and also what's coming in.
Well, the two
Right?
the two things, Eric. So know your numbers and know the in and the out. You need to know both sides of that. How much you've got coming in and how much you've got going out. One of the things with teams, not to jump too far ahead, but with teams, now they have to have administrators. Those wages for administrators are just going through the roof to get a good one and to retain a good one. So again, when you're bringing team members in, you need to know their numbers. You need to know what their conversion rate is. And I ask my agents, what's their conversion rate like? I don't know. Well, why don't you know? How many leads did you get them? How many turned into something? It's very simple. You got to track it all. But first you got to know what it is. You got to dream a little bit about what the income's going to be. But the hard costs are the things that go out. That you can't really change. You know, how much your car costs you to run, maintenance, gas, all those other things that don't go away.
For sure. And I think, one of the other things that's difficult is not just, okay, we know those hard costs and we know what they cost us because we know we get those bills. Here's your fee. Here's what your insurance costs.
Right.
Here's the board fees, et cetera, et cetera. But then I look at it and go, there's some people that will tell me, oh, Eric, I'd be responsible for this salary, for this admin. But what I tell them is, if somebody gave you an extra 40 hours a week from doing, admin costs, how much could you get an extra deal or two a month? If I give you an extra 40 hours a week away from that stuff, and everybody always tells me, yes, well then why don't you do it? because that one deal will pay for their salary for a few months. And they go, yeah, but I'm still worried. And so I think, I've heard, I've talked to people that go, look, if it's a $20 an hour job, and I've even seen, one of the big influencers right now in creating businesses and making money off owning business, Cody Sanchez. And she's saying, like, if it's $50 an hour or less, you outsource that to somebody, because you need to do the tasks that make you money and not be tied up. So sometimes you have to take that hard cost and realize that it helps you make money. But you got to know how much more. So I know that when we're talking about admins, one of the things, we will talk about in compensation is, let's say you're an existing agent and you are doing, say, $250,000, and you were to bring on an admin. What you might say is, look, by bringing them on, if you can get to $300,000, let's say, you make an extra $50,000, you might bonus them a percent or something. And so there's that incentive for them to help you out. But again, you got to know your numbers.
Yeah.
But it's not all just about that cost. You got to take a look and say, this hard cost, did it add anything to my business other than just an expense? Right?
Well, I'm kind of smiling because what happens is, the reality is, my teams go out and get an administrator, and then they micromanage the crap out of the administrator. Let the administrator do what they do. Let Remax Escarpment teach your administrator what to do. Do that. Your job, and you're probably not good at it anyway, is not to teach an administrator what to do. Your job is to go sell and talk to clients, make sure clients are happy, find out who's moving next, just build that pipeline so there is business. So to your point, if they let the administrator do what he or she does, they would be fine. But they tend not to sometimes. So again, it's learning to be a good CEO delegates. A CEO cannot do they need an overview, but they don't do it. And there's where the difference is. A lot of times my team leaders fall down in their ability to allow and focus on what they do and let an admin focus on what they do. So
letting go of control.
Your point is excellent, but to grow a business, any business, you need to let go of some of the things. You need to trust in your decision. You've put them in the right hands. Let them do what they do so you can go do what you do. I couldn't agree with you more. My great sales teams, they should never touch paperwork. And that's a good thing, because they're great at what they do, which is taking care of clients, working on sales, helping negotiate complicated deals. They shouldn't be doing the $30 to $40 an hour jobs.
Exactly. And I say to people, if you look at a lawyer, lawyers will make $200, $500, $200 to $500 an hour, or even more.
Or more.
And do you want them doing the photocopying? It's like, no. You get the admin, gets paid, gets charged out a lot less to do that photocopying. Yeah. And so, and I'm reminded of when we were talking about this episode, one of the things that you said to me was, you got to learn how to become the moneymaker.
Yes.
And so that goes to your point, right? Is the job of the agent is to be the moneymaker and bring in the business.
The rainmaker. I call them also the rainmaker.
There you go.
They have to generate the leads, which generates the work, which keeps the entire team busy, including the administrator. They are not the person that's supposed to be turning in paperwork or micromanaging an administrator. That's a tough thing, but for a lot of people, it's not easy to delegate. And so that is one of the bigger challenges when you're doing that. But right now, we're trying to focus on getting the business, knowing your numbers, knowing what you're spending, and then figuring out how much out of that piece of pie you can put aside to keep building your business with other platforms.
And I think, keyword, you just triggered. I like how we trigger each other on this, is that you said about that piece of the pie. And so we've both experienced agents who took that entire check and said, wow, look at all this money I have.
No.
Baby, let's go to town.
Yeah.
But that money's not all theirs.
No.
And so being able to set money aside for taxes, because, I tell people all the time, when I got introduced to real estate, it was working with this real estate lawyer. And I had agents coming up to me and saying, hey, do you guys do tax law? Like, I owe over $300,000 in back taxes because they would take all that check and spend it.
Yeah.
And they didn't set that aside. And I think that's, another piece of the puzzle is, you take, when you do your budget and you do your finances and you're tracking your money, it's okay, well, how much of this I'm going to put towards marketing? How much of this is going to the federal government?
Right.
Set aside for my taxes. Right. Here in Canada, we typically, our agents will pay quarterly on their HST, and then perhaps some of them do charity. So, a lot of our RE/MAX agents do Children's Miracle Network. I know some great Christian realtors that will tithe 10%.
Right.
Whatever it is, I mean, it's tracking that and having that set aside. And then what you're left with is this chunk of money that you got to split between your personal to pay yourself and also put back into your business. And speaking of the self, is that I've also come across agents that like to, and I think this is extremely wise, is agents that set up and pay themselves a salary.
Yes.
Right? And we've seen that, like, in, I guess, no discussion on finance would be, full if we didn't talk about the Personal Real Estate Corporation or the PREC. But being able to set that up to save yourself some money. And most of those cases, most of those people will set themselves up with a salary.
Right.
What have you seen, like, talking to people, like?
Well, you just did that trigger thing again. So, and this is going back a few years, but I used to do a pie chart, a pie graph, and it was kind of based around what your why was for being in real estate. Why are you even in real estate? And after you pay all those things, and what are the driving forces that make you want to do this job? Because you got to be part crazy to do this job, because I don't think there's any other business in the world that will work this hard and do everything and spend all this money just for the opportunity of potentially getting an income from it. So sometimes people would say to me, well, I want to take my kids, they need to go to university, I want to take them on a big trip. Everybody's why is different, right? So you do the pie chart, big circle. You take out 20 to 30% for the government. You take out another 20 to 30% for what you have in fees, et cetera, costs, et cetera. And you're left with this other small percent. And what it amounts to sometimes is you're actually left about 1% left in this pie. And then you go and give everybody a reduction in your fee, because somehow you think you're on the deed of that property and you have some financial obligation to help these people afford the house, which you don't. And if you're one of my agents, you hear this from me all the time. So you got to make sure that when you do all this, you don't give away this small piece that actually is yours. Because when it comes down to it, if you start giving away 1%, that could be almost 33% of your paycheck. That's a lot to give away. So that's another thing to consider in here. You need to also know what you're charging in commission and what your bottom line is, where it starts to cut into your why, where it takes away from your family, where it isn't worth doing it anymore, right? So that's another piece of this puzzle we got to think about.
Huge. And it's funny, the 1% you were talking about, I just did a class a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about this, is, it's very easy to say, hey, I'll give you 1%, 0.5%. But what they don't look at is, what does that actual equate to in dollars, right? What does it equate to in dollars? So when the tracking sheet that I give to our agents, we put down what was the commission, like, here's the name, the address, was it a buy or sell? Right. So we track how many buys, how many sell, and we had, then we track the percentage. So what percentage did you do? What did that equate to in dollars? Right. And then at the, it allows us to see that average. But what I say to people is, if I had, if it was a difference between, say, 4% and 5%, you go, I'll give you 1%. But on $1 million, what does that equate to? Right? Like, that's $10,000. So it's,
what part of your lifestyle do you want to give up?
Exactly.
What are you giving up when you give that up?
And how much did it cost me? And we talked about, you mentioned about staging, I've seen agents where they say, hey, I'll pay for the first month, you pay after. I see agents that say you pay for staging. Sometimes they'll come back and take it off the end. So yeah, there's a lot of great things you can do, but if you're not tracking it,
Right.
and we go
That's my
back
point.
to, you and I always talk, you can't measure what you don't track.
That's right.
So if we're not tracking this, then, all of a sudden it's a surprise. I sold
be.
how many homes and only have this
Shouldn't
much
be.
money?
Oh, and by the way, my award level isn't where I thought it would be. Yeah. Right. So again, very important decisions that need to be looked at the beginning of the year when you're putting your business plan together. And this spreadsheet that Eric has is amazing. It really is. If you take the time and trouble to fill it out, use it, and stick with it, it'll help you know where you're going with things. You shouldn't be losing your 33% off to help somebody else afford a house that they can't afford, or because they all of a sudden want that deal to close. And then that all goes back to the quality of the clients that you're working with. You want to be working with good people that have the ability to close and know that. So there's so many layers of it in here, but the goal here is just to identify that so you can start to really hone in on what these costs are. Typically what happens in this business, you'll have a great year like 2021. Conrad calls it the year of the 1,000-year flood, right? Big year. But then guess what? The next year follows and things are down a little bit. But meanwhile, we've taken all these cruises and spent all this money, and we don't have anything in reserve.
Yep.
So now we're going into the next year with a tighter budget, and maybe people aren't moving as much. So it's always good to build consistency into all of the different markets we have.
And I think that also lends itself to really, when you're looking at your business, we talked about setting aside a salary for yourself.
Right.
And like Lynn was just saying, is that when you have that great year, and it's easy to, hey, we can live large, let's do this, but then next year maybe it's not a great year, and we created a lifestyle we can't live up to. So having a salary and saying, look, I'm going to bare minimum, here's what I have enough set aside. Again, knowing your budget. So if we have a budget for our home, and this is what it costs for me to live and to run my business, and I have enough money, say, for 6 months. And so now, you know what, we can take a little bit that extra money, that bonus, and let's do a big trip.
Yeah.
But realize that it's not going to necessarily happen every year until you start building that consistency.
But you've planned
But
for
there's still even consistency. I've known some great teams that are consistent in everything they do, but they still have the ups and downs. The market changes. So I think we know this, and hey, I will freely admit to the entire world that, when I got my second marriage, when I got married, we started having some conversations, and I hated having them. They were difficult conversations about money. It was conversations I never had in my previous relationship. And so, I've come to embrace that financial side, and I see the importance, and I see what we're trying to create as a family unit, as a couple. And so it's the same thing in your business. It is a difficult conversation for a lot of people, but it is a necessary conversation, because if you want to be successful, and you want to be able to, you can build up a business and say, you know what, I can walk away at any time, or you can be one of those realtors who's like, I can't walk away because I haven't put away enough money. And it's tough when you see people in that situation,
And
right?
unfortunately, I see a lot of people in that situation.
Yeah.
So there's no planning going on, and you're right, it's painful. I can tell you that. But the other thing that I think people are forgetting about is the business itself is a separate entity. That's why you should really take yourself a paycheck. And this is where the PREC helps as well. You're putting money into retained earnings, which means it stays there for the business. That is very, very important, to have retained earnings in your business. Don't spend all that money, because you really have to feed the business. The business and your database and your business is the golden goose. If you don't feed it, it will get skinny and there won't be anything left of it, right? So while you may have a partner or a spouse going, well, why are you doing that? We got all this money. Why don't we go here? Why don't we go there? Why don't we do this? no, that's not in the business plan. The business plan is I want to achieve this many months free and clear. So if it does have a downturn, we're still covered. We don't suffer. But you'll know if you have excess enough to go for a nice Disney cruise or whatever it is your heart desires to do, right?
Yeah.
It just comes down to planning. And that's right from how many clients you're going to have, where they're going to come from, your success rate on those, the whole thing. Everything has to be planned to what you'll take in commission, what you'll do, what the lowest is you'll do. Everything really has to be planned. Your goal is to go from stability to being successful and having enough to significance. And when you get to significance, you don't have to worry about these things. You know, you might buy an investment property or two. So many people go out when they're still in the stability mode and aren't paying the bills on time, run out and buy an investment property. And then they get sideways on that, and it's not really helping them. So one of the great things about being in real estate is it gives you an insight into the real estate market, and you can use your money to go and buy investments and have some rental properties.
Yeah.
But, you know, in this market, again, it's a little tricky if you don't have enough money to sustain that while the market's taking its shift. It doesn't last forever. It always changes. But again, don't be jumping to that significance when you haven't got your bills paid every month or you're behind on your government taxes. And that's the worst I see, is a lot of people behind on their RevCan bills.
Yep.
And that's scary because they're going to get that plus a lot of interest on top of it.
I think one thing I want to add as well is I know when we've worked with some of our courses for new agents, we talk about when you put together that budget for marketing a listing, you know, one of the key phrases we talk about is this is how much I'm willing, or not willing, but this is how much I'm going to invest into your home. And my guaranteed return rate is 0 because there is no guarantee. You know, and I've seen agents that were like $12,000 in because they did full staging, everything, as Lynn said. You know, it's expensive. It can be pricey to do full staging. And then the client cancels the listing.
Yeah.
And in this case, they said, well, you know, we are going to list this other house, but they just spent $12,000 and it's gone. And so I would say to you as an agent, when you create that budget, are you willing to invest that and potentially lose it? In the sense, like you said, sometimes things don't close. We've seen markets in the last few years, you know, the last decade, there have been a couple of times where homes sold, they went crazy, values were going up, sellers were getting all kinds of money. And then by the time it went to close, the market had cooled off and appraisals came in and people couldn't have the money, they couldn't close. So now we're scrambling and it gets less and you've already spent that money. And so that's why on my spreadsheet, when I'm working with the agents is, okay, here's what you can expect the check to be, but then it's in the pending column. We haven't actually received it, so there's another column where you check off, yeah, I've received it. So I think what happens is, yes, a lot of people spend money that they don't have yet.
A lot.
Right?
So just
That's crazy, but it's so easy to do.
We
It's
do it
so
all the
easy.
time. Everybody does it all the time. And there are some things you can do, particularly around the marketing costs. The higher the value of the house, the longer it's going to stay on the market. So we've got listings now that are anywhere from $5 to $11 million in some of our offices. They take a lot longer. So the marketing budget, you need a bigger marketing budget for something like that. You might need to have a higher commission on something like that, just a thought. You might need to have a conversation with the homeowner about that. You know, if I keep it in on these platforms for X amount of time, or I do this extra thing, this is what it's going to cost. If you don't close, or if we don't close, or if you decide to cancel this listing through no fault of mine, but just because you feel like doing it today, this is what I'm expected to be paid back for these fees. Anything can be negotiated. Anything is possible, but you got to talk about it, which is something that most agents don't like to discuss these things because they're messy, and you need to talk about them. You need to get them in hard copy and writing. Same with staging. If the person is, well, I just want to test the market, okay, well, they're testing it with your $8,000 to $10,000 worth of staging in it. Have a conversation.
Yeah.
If they don't like the way the market's going, they're going to pay it back, or they pay back half of it, or whatever you want to do with them. But start to think a little bit outside the box, because then at the end, when they are looking at you, well, can you reduce this to 1%? You're really screwed. You're tapping into your own money, and your own resources for helping sell this house. And I don't like to see people get in this spot because it's not a good place to be. So again, start to think about the other conversations that you can have and how you might want to approach that with people before you take the listing.
And it goes back to, in our first episode, we talked about mindset. Yeah. And for me, is understanding the value that you bring to the table.
100%.
And when you look at the average agent and what they're doing to promote a listing, for example,
right.
And the average agent, I know when I looked in Niagara region last year, I think the average, like 70% of agents did 5 deals or less. Mm-hmm. So they're not doing a lot of business, so they're probably not putting a lot into. But I've seen a lot of agents that just do sort of bare minimum. So if they're the ones doing it for such a low percentage, and you're providing so much more, understand the value that brings to selling that house more quickly for more money. Mm-hmm. And so again, it's know your numbers. Yeah. And so it's not just the financial side, like, yes, I'm going to invest this much money, but here's what it turns into.
Right.
We've looked at, the list to sale ratio. Right. Hey, I typically get 10% more than the average agent. So that lends to the client getting more money when the house sells. So that's another key number to look at is what am I generating for my clients and generating that wealth? And here's why it's worth paying that extra percentage to me. Mm-hmm. But it does come back to here's what it's going to cost me. So here's what I'm investing into your home. And I know my numbers.
I would suspect that there are very few agents that know what their list to sale ratio is.
I agree.
And that's a shame because you need to know it. We have a facility to make them look like superstars when they use that at the table, talking to their clients. So again, those are all parts about why a person should use you. The staging does help. I mean, I can prove in numbers that the staging really helps, but it's expensive. So you can't be doing it for free. You can't be doing it on a discount brokerage fee. You've got to have all these things planned for. But again, everything we've just discussed all comes down to one thing. Plan.
Yeah.
Budget. Know your numbers. All your numbers.
And don't be afraid to have that difficult conversation. Whether you're working with a manager, your business coach, your accountant, embrace the difficult conversations. Trust me, I've gone through this. It is well worth it in the end. And when you can freely have those conversations, man, now it's just so much easier and simpler to go through business and life, knowing what your numbers are and being unafraid to have that conversation with the client.
I think if you know how much you need to make and you know what you need to get in commission to pay what you need to do to have the income left over for you and your family, it becomes a lot easier to say, I'm sorry, I'm not a 1.5%er. I'm not a discount model. This is what I charge. And just close your books very neatly and be willing to walk away from it. Walking away is the best negotiating tool there ever was. Having said that, though, when you're ready to walk away, you need to have a pipeline full of people to go to.
Yep.
You will be forced to deal with that type of client that will, be battering at your door every day right up until closing to reduce your commission if you allow them to work with you. And if that's the only client you have, you'll work with them. So all these things interconnect and hinge on each other. Your ability to have great clients is your ability to know your numbers and your ability to walk away when you know it doesn't meet what you need to get for your income.
Yep.
If that makes sense to everybody, I think that's the biggest takeaway we're talking about here.
Yeah. So truly, money does matter, a lot. So create those budgets, have those difficult conversations around finance, and go out there and build a successful business. Thank you for joining us on today's podcast. See you next time.